So it's an honor to be back at mHealth at Duke conference, the 5th annual mHealth at Duke. Thank you for inviting me back to help moderate and this distinguished group of speakers and panelists here. It's really a joy to see this continue for me because it's been a passion of mine while I was here. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy to introduce this next session. The title of this session is How Do You Evaluate Your Solution? And you'd think that where it is in the program, and naturally you think about this as something, first you look at the feasibility, you may look at the usability, and then you do the evaluation. And so this should naturally come next, right? But actually, I think that evaluation should come up front. And we ought to be thinking a little bit more about what it means when we begin to implement how our solution would be implemented. How are we going to know that it's safe, that it's cost effective, that it is working the way it's intended to work? So, thinking about feasibility and usability, yes, that's important, but thinking about evaluation as you're beginning the process is probably equally important. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and begin the discussion and introduce our speakers. The way we'll work this is I'll introduce each speaker first, and they'll say a few words about what evaluation means to them. They're each kind of approaching this from a different perspective, and that's important because there's a number of ways that we can approach evaluation. So I'll start here with Dr. Schulman. Dr. Schulman is Associate Director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute and Duke School of Medicine. Dr. Schulman is a professor of medicine and the Gregory Mario and Jeremy Mario Professor of Business Administration at Duke University. He's also a visiting professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. He holds several leadership appointments at Duke. He is an associate director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute in the School of Medicine. His other university affiliations include the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and History of Medicine, the Duke Translational Medicine Institute, and the Duke Global Health Institute. Wears a lot of hats. So Dr. Schulman is a distinguished researcher, received more than $48 million in research grants. His research interests include health services research and policy, including access to care, and impact of reimbursement and regulatory policy on clinical practice, health economics and economic evaluation in research, and medical decision-making, especially in patients with life-threatening conditions. And he teaches courses in biotechnology, health policy, and health IT strategy. So we're honored to have you here, Dr. Schulman. Maybe you can start us off.
Great. Well, great. Thanks so much for inviting me, and sorry for a long introduction. So I as an advertisement, I run started the MMCI program here at Duke, and we have a little booth over there. So if anyone's interested, the Master of Management in Clinical Informatics, and I think our next presentation is one of our current students. In terms of this, thinking about this, I want to kind of address three issues about evaluation. My career has been in health services research, technology assessment the entire time, and so I think there's lots of really specific things that are, methodologically that are interesting. But the three points I want to make are: the first is we can't think about the economics of some new application until you think about the business model. And Clay Christensen really lays out two ideas, one of something called the sustaining innovation, one's called the disruptive innovation. But basically, if you take our new thing and overlay it on an existing infrastructure, we're not going to see fantastic economic returns because you're still paying for all the buildings here on Duke campus. Even if you were totally virtual for that activity, 85% of our costs are fixed, and so the overhead allocation to you is going to economically dwarf whatever the benefits are. And so the first question is kind of, what is the business model? Is the business model something I'm going to sell to Duke and explain what the ROI is over the next 3 years and have them challenge that? Or is this something I'm going to go start up across the street and have patients scamper over to the benefits they get from my technology and then maybe Duke will come around, or maybe it'll be like IBM, when you get to 100 million bucks in revenue, I'll buy you. The second thing is actually a conflict, a really interesting conflict these days between the idea of assessment of technology and lean startup. So I love the concept of lean startup. I love teaching lean startup. In Global Health Institute, we just did something with patient-centered design. It was really, really exciting, except that it's not fundable from a grant. Okay? If you say, I'm going to make your grant applications, I'm going to write this thing and I'm going to pivot 3 times in the first year as I follow the market, what's the reviewer going to say on that? And I think inherently we have a big issue here, because I think the way we have to develop these technologies is to follow these methodologies that are working for us in other segments of the market, but they don't look like grants. You know, maybe you need private capital or something else, or maybe we need to change the grant funding to allow some wiggle room. And then finally, I gave out this paper to a startup in Nigeria that's doing digital health, and it was a paper we wrote 20 years ago, looking at telemedicine, and the idea was that we shouldn't think of an application as the be-all and end-all as we're developing it. We should think about technology development the same way we think about drug development. You'd never, at the end of a phase 1 clinical trial, ask the question, what's the economic value to society of your phase 1 product? You know, I barely know if it's safe. I don't even know what the right dosage is. Don't ask me what the downstream benefits are likely to be, because it's just too early. So one of my fears would be, while I definitely have to have an objective that I have to understand the sales cycle, I have to understand who I'm going to sell this product to at the end of the road, if you ask really, really hard questions really early, the technology is not going to be able to answer them. And you're going to choke off something that could be really promising. So, I know this is the evaluation piece, but I think the evaluation should be appropriate. You know, does the thing turn on? You know, that's a really kind of critical issue. If it doesn't, you know, if it works, that's a really cool thing. If it works and actually interfaces with somebody, it's even cooler. And then eventually you can ask really, really tough questions as you go forward. But if you ask them too early, unfortunately, that'll be the end of it.
Great, thank you. I think what we'll do is we'll continue with the brief introductions and talks, and then at the end we'll have a little bit more time to ask some questions. So next we'll hear from Dr. Chile. Dr. Chile is an assistant professor of medicine and a hospitalist physician at Duke University Hospital and medical and program director for the care redesign at Duke University Health System. He oversees medical and nursing leadership, medical and nursing leaders who convene multidisciplinary clinical teams across the organization to develop and implement evidence-based approaches to care delivery. And Duke Care Redesign teams span more than 30 medical and surgical acute and chronic illness episodes and improve quality and efficiency of care for more than 30,000 patients. So welcome, Dr. Chile, and we're happy to hear from you next.
Couple slides. So again, I'm a hospitalist by training and work with doctors and nurses to redesign care processes to improve outcomes and to reduce costs. So I have a very clinical bent when I talk to you about evaluation of your solutions, and I'm going to talk specifically about clinical outcomes, how to identify the right outcomes, and how to design a solution to really move the needle on those outcomes. And we work with teams across an integrated delivery system, 3 hospitals, an employed primary care practice, closely collaborating with the Duke faculty physician practice. And so our problems are unique to academic centers, but also common to community centers. And when I'm thinking about how to solve some of the clinical problems that the teams we work with are facing, I jump immediately to the process. And when I say the process here, I'm talking about the clinical process. So let me walk you through what I mean. A biker who's getting on in years develops some hip pain. That biker sees his primary care doc, gets an x-ray, X-ray shows arthritis. The primary care doc refers the patient to the orthopedic clinic. Patient meets a nursing assistant who takes his vital signs, meets a medical assistant who reviews his history, ultimately meets a surgeon who talks to him about his medical conditions, decides if he's a smoker, whether he needs to quit smoking before he can go to surgery, if he has diabetes, whether he needs to delay surgery to control his disease, to reduce his risk of infection. Ultimately, if the patient's deemed an appropriate candidate, he's scheduled for surgery, arrives at the hospital the day of, meets an anesthesia team to confirm the right location of surgery. He reviews the pain regimen the anesthesiologist will use. Anesthesiologists start to control his pain, bring him back to the OR, start antibiotics to prevent infection, put him to sleep. The surgeon comes in, cuts through the skin, cuts through the tissues, reshapes the bone, implants the device, closes the tissues, closes the skin. The patient goes back to the anesthesia care unit to wake up. Once he's awake and stable in the care unit, he goes to the hospital floor to make sure his pain's controlled. He's up and moving around well enough so that his caregiver at home is going to be able to take care of him. His bladder's functioning after getting a catheter removed from the bladder. And once he's at home, he's going to need to make it to the pharmacy, or a loved one's going to need to make it to the pharmacy to pick up pain medicines, to pick up medicine to prevent blood clots from forming. He's going to need to go to physical therapy to increase the mobility of that new joint he just got. And hopefully 6 months later, he's going to be back on that bike, which was the reason that he wanted to start there in the first place. Now, for people interested in solving problems, I hope that sparked some ideas for you all. And for me, when I'm thinking about how to evaluate whether a solution is going to solve some of the problems that can crop up in those processes, I'm jumping to measurement, as Kevin alluded to, in thinking about what are the ways in which we as a provider organization describe some of those problems. There are different frameworks to describe those clinical process measures and clinical outcomes. I actually like the way Medicare breaks it down because it's fairly straightforward to explain. Everyone's goal is to first do no harm. We want to live through surgery. We don't want any basic errors. We don't want any complications that we can avoid. Once we've achieved that goal, we want to deliver care that's in accordance with evidence, that's in accordance with guidelines, and happens as reliably as possible. For those of you who are starting to look at quality measures as a potential tool to evaluate your solutions, if you've been on the guideline clearinghouses, they're a little overwhelming. So for us as an organization, we focus on guidelines and on quality measures that are tied to payments for performance first. We also focus closely on publicly reported quality measures. And we have a lot of internal priorities also. We're kind of trying to move above and beyond. And so there are a couple of different data vendors, Vizient, Premier are probably the two best known, who describe quality and performance data in ways that provider organizations can compare their performance to peers. So we're delivering safe care, we're delivering what evidence should suggest we should be doing for patients. We also want to do that without wasting time and without wasting resources. And so in my mind, that's one framework to use to begin to think about measurement tools for how me as a solver of clinical problems will be looking at a solution to gauge what I need to measure to determine its impact. And then over the course of that process, increasingly, I know others are going to talk about patients' experience, but our clinical teams are really taking more and more ownership of that experience over that entire process as well. So it's hard for me to separate these different categories because they're all ways to really describe the problems that crop up in that process. Now, I mentioned a lot of people over the course of this delivery who have busy jobs, complex jobs, and are involved in making complex decisions. And so I'm not tasked specifically with talking about how to design meaningful solutions, But I did think it would be helpful to describe some of my ideal characteristics that I'm looking for when a vendor approaches me with a solution to figure out if it's going to move the needle on some of those clinical measures. And so I want to know how specific that solution is to the problem that comes up in that process. If I'm going to invest the time and energy in working with doctors and nurses to implement that solution, I'd like it to be alterable so that I can apply it to other similar clinical areas. Clickless is aspirational. What I mean there is really as work neutral as possible, because again, these are busy people. The solution's not going to work if it adds a significant amount of time and effort to their day. And then we, like many other places around the country, have deployed an increasingly complex electronic health infrastructure. So to the extent a solution is easily integrable, has a similar look and feel, works with our existing data warehouse and data structures, is safe for patients, is secure to meet the compliance needs that we have in organization, that's going to have a much easier time flying at this place. And then, in terms of deployment and time and effort invested in deployment, something that's easy to use, easy to train, and that you don't need a medical degree to learn how to use is going to be much more successful in terms of integrating into those workflows. And then we wind up taking on a lot of the costs for maintenance, whether that's in retraining or reprogramming. So those low maintenance solutions are much more likely to make it on the list of our consideration set for solving some of those clinical problems.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Chile. It's okay to applaud, yes. Very good. But questions afterwards, applause afterwards, no questions, and then questions. Okay. So our next speaker is Roger Villadarga. Close? Almost. Okay. Villadarga. Okay. Is an assistant professor at the Center for Addiction Science and Technology at Duke University and is affiliate professor at Duke's Global Health Science Center and Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. Roger is passionate about the potential of mobile technologies for the advancement of contextual behavioral science and the development of cost-effective and high-reaching behavioral interventions. Roger studied psychology at the University of Barcelona and received his doctoral degree in clinical psychology from the University of Nevada, Reno in 2014. And he also, and in 2014, he received a 5-year Pathway to Independence Award from NIDA. This award provided training in user-centered design and funded a 3-year pilot randomized control trial to test the initial feasibility of the first NIH-funded smartphone app to deliver smoking cessation treatments for individuals with serious mental illness. From 2010 to 2015, he has served as associate editor for the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science. So welcome, Dr. Villadarga.
Thank you. I wasn't counting on such long introduction. So I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about the mHealth work that I've done over the years. I started this path in 2011. I did some work in looking at the applications designed to translate mindfulness process or mindfulness practice into mobile. So I did some work on that area. I also done work in chronic pain, and this is a project funded by Pfizer. And we developed a mobile application to actually help chronic pain patients self-manage more effectively. We also have done work with patients with gastrointestinal problems using a self-experimentation framework. And then most recently, I've been applying this kind of mindfulness approach to working with children. So I've done kind of a diversity of work in this area. But most of my work has, over the last years, I've been focusing on developing a smoking cessation app for people with serious mental illness. So this app, once it was complete and built, it got some media coverage and it got a couple of words. But the most exciting thing to me is that actually it's going to be tested in a randomized controlled trial funded by NIDA. So let me give you a little bit of the sense of what I think or this might sound a little bit catastrophic, but I think there's a little bit of testing crisis in mHealth. So if we look at, for example, mindfulness apps, there's about 600 apps, and a very minuscule part of those apps have ever been tested in a randomized controlled trial, a quarter of 1% of them. So this is a little bit of a problem, I think. And when it comes to a problem that is more serious, like tobacco addiction to nicotine, the situation is pretty much the same. There's about 540 apps that are out there, and less than 1% of them have ever been tested as well. And again, testing doesn't necessarily mean always a randomized controlled trial, but I'll go into that in a second. The other issues that we found in the CFAS Center was that even amongst smartphone users who are smokers, a very small portion of them have ever even tried a smartphone app, 6%. So that's not necessarily a testing crisis, it is a reach crisis, but it's something also to keep in mind. So testing apps is almost like a startup endeavor in and of itself. So here, you can see a little bit layout of the learn to quit process. You need to think about getting funded. You need to think about conducting expert panel expertise. Think about the behavioral components of this intervention, user testing, design, ideation, sketching, and so forth. And then at the end of that, you also need to think about methodological strategies to test it and test the efficacy and generalizability of these results to larger population, which what the RCTs are built for. But in a way, randomized controlled trials are very important, but they can be a little bit like a giant with feet of clay, because if they fall, they can fall big. And what I mean by falling is not necessarily a no results trial, but it can be that maybe you know that one intervention works better than another, but you don't really know why. And even though you can add mediation analysis and moderation, it doesn't really give you a more fine-grained sense of what are the stimuli that are actually driving a certain individual under certain circumstances, and that's a problem. If they work well, though, they can have a huge impact because they can change public policy, and they can demonstrate that this intervention is generalizable to, or those effects are generalizable to a population. So on the other side, more agile methods or smaller scale studies can also be like a mice that has a voice that no one hears, because those studies are very small, even though they might be really agile. They're not generalizable, and it's little that you can do, even with iteration or triangulation or cross-validation. It doesn't tell you don't have the more definitive answer of this intervention is generalizable. They, however, are great for building really well-crafted interventions and mobile technologies, and so they have a huge plus. So what can we do, I think, in my opinion? So I think it's really important to think about methodological diversity, not just one method, but many. And I think very often we're looking for a silver bullet, and what is the RCT or the agile or lean but I think, as a field, as a community, developing health interventions, we need to think about adding diversity. And in the same way that biological diversity is the strength and determines the resilience of a biological system, in the same way our community of researchers and our work benefits from that methodological diversity. And the other component of it is methodological rigor, because and I wouldn't describe rigor as inflexible or rigid methods. You can have very easy, iterable methodological approaches like N-of-1 trials or different approaches that allow you to answer questions quickly. And I think that's really important because both in industry and in academia, because if you're a producer or a project coordinator or project manager, and someone comes with you with data you cannot rely, qualitative interviews that were not transcribed or were biasly coded, that's something that is of much less value. So methodological rigor I think it's both important for academia and for the industry, the way we approach this process. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an example of some of the work I've done in terms of figuring out different ways of innovating or approaching evaluation of mHealth technology. So we conducted a while ago, like a few months ago, single case experimental trials of the smoking cessation app that I just mentioned. And what we were able to accomplish with this more quicker pace methodology was in a span of like a few months, we conducted 30-day trials where we were randomizing people to try one app or another, and also we randomized the length of exposure to subjects to each one of those apps. And the key message I want to kind of give you from this slide is that internal validity and rigor matters, and those are questions that can be achieved even beyond the RCT framework. This study allows us to demonstrate that providing one app or the other, we could reliably increase usability, and that our app that we developed on average had higher levels of usability in our target population. We were also to use at the same time qualitative methods to understand the user experience. So we coded the data, we elaborated, and we found themes that pertain to each one of those apps. And we actually learned a lot of valuable information that we are pursuing to publish. And at the same time, we're able to look at background analytics, and that's another dimension of data that allowed us to see, at a click level, how participants were engaging and how there was sustained use over time with the use of these apps. So I think it might sound like overwhelming to think about going through this kind of long list of process, that might take years to accomplish in terms of ideation, design, testing, and RCTs. But sometimes being the first doesn't mean that you get the prize, and you get the example with the iPad. And another message that I kind of wanted to convey is that it's really important to think about this partnership between industry and academia. And if you go back to 300 years ago, during the 1600s, at that time there was a very important partnership that occurred between natural scientists and craftsmen of the time. Natural scientists couldn't accomplish much without lenses that empowered their eye to actually understand the universe in a much better fine-grained way. And in the same way, the work of craftsmen was empowered by the need to tackle problems of huge human implications and concern. So that partnership between the industry and craftsmen is what we could define nowadays between partnership between industry and academia. And I think it's important to stay between, to really acknowledge and have appreciate and value, because sometimes there's a cultural divide, and that doesn't contribute to that symbiotic, important relationship that can lead to great gains. One example I like to convey in a kind of graphic way. So, what academics can do in terms of designing and crafting good tools is very limited. This is a handmade microscope. So not a lot that can be, we don't have the expertise that the industry have to actually build good, well-designed, crafted tools that we can use to empower our science. And the same thing is true for the opposite. The industry, without the collaboration with academia, can design incredibly engaging and addictive tools that matter very little and have very little societal value. As opposed to something like the PTSD Coach, which is an app developed by the T2 Center in Seattle that, even though it might not have all the bells and whistles of a lot of the mobile technologies developed by the industry, has shown to actually had a huge impact in the lives of veterans and people suffering with PTSD. So I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our next speaker and panelist is John Hudson. He's the Digital Marketing Director for Vital Plan, Digital Strategies, and SEO Consultant. John has spent 20 years immersed in digital marketing, media strategy, and analytics. He's been He's been a digital consultant for hospitals, medical device and pharmaceutical companies such as GSK, Amgen, and Teva. He has recently worked with ad agencies and online startups such as Vital Plan to show them how to get more out of their their data and digital marketing. John began his career in the ad agency, an ad man, I guess, right? That's so good. Where he helped grow a startup agency called MedThink Communications into the largest healthcare agency in the Triangle. At MedThink, he served as vice president of strategy and innovation and founded the Insights and Connections Department, a cross-functional team that leverages data and analytics to fuel strategic marketing and business decisions. John also created a research process called Data plus Soul that connects quantitative and qualitative data to drive unique insights and breakthrough ideas. Welcome, John.
Thank you. And my background is in marketing, and I've worn a lot of hats over the years. Formerly, I was a media director, SEO. I was really focused on driving traffic, driving acquisition, driving people to clinical trials, events, and things like that, driving to a website. And I got a newfound love for usage analytics due to a pop-up ad, believe it or not, several years ago. I was working with a large pharmaceutical company. They had just launched this beautiful website, lots of traffic, 100,000 users a month, and they just asked me to take a look at it. And looking at the data, I saw that the website had an 80% bounce rate. So bounce rate is when somebody comes to your website, they look at one page and then they leave. There's no engagement there. There's no retention. There's no relationship made. So that's bad. And this was on their homepage too, which is really bad. So it turns out that after talking with them, they said that they did launch a little pop-up on their homepage, again, putting their business goals before user goals on that. But that wasn't the whole problem. Looking into the data a little bit more, found that this wasn't a little pop-up. When you segmented the users coming to their site and the screen resolution that they were using, it was a huge pop-up. It took up their whole screen. And also there was one important thing that they forgot to include, which is that button. And one of the most clicked buttons around. And it looks simple now, but it's one of those things at first glance you don't see it until you dig into the data. And that's why this quote from Avanish Kaushik, that is a digital analytics guru, just sticks with me. Don't let marketing write checks your website can't cash. And I think you could fill that in with your app or your tool. It means when you test it, when you put it in beta, when you launch it, there are going to be leaks. It's just inevitable. And you just want to plug those leaks as fast as you can, find those leaks as fast as you can, and then make your boat stronger, make it last. Because there's so many beautiful tools, so many beautiful apps, so much great content out there that it's a shame it's not doing better. And a lot of times it's just taking a look at your data, take a look at your analytics, that's your users talking to you, and infer what it is that they're looking for and try to match your business goals with the user goals. So usage analytics, very important. The way I look at it, I know we talk a lot about changing behavior and positive outcomes, and I think it works the same way when I'm evaluating and looking at tools. Because what I'm looking for is how can we fix what's broken? How can we make it better? So ultimately, I'm trying to change behavior within the tool, and I'm also trying to produce a positive outcome with the tool. Whatever the goal of the tool is, I want it to do better. So that's the goal of usage analytics. Now, as far as upfront planning, this is crucial. I've seen so many times that tools are made or websites are launched without thinking, what's the purpose of this tool? What's the data that I need to capture? What are our ultimate goals? Because it's so easy once you launch to get washed in data, to get completely lost. So try to choose those key indicators that are going to show that your tool is working, that it's a success. And also try to map out what you think the user flow should be through that website or through that app, so that once you do launch or once you are testing it, you can see how aligned those things are. Now this one, I said capture the necessary data, so you planned it, you know what you need, you mapped it out, now to actually capture it. And I put an exclamation point there on purpose because this is the most painful part of the process. I've seen too many times where it's not being captured properly. I had a client where I had to tell them You know what, your website metrics are doing fantastic, incredible engagement. The problem is it's not your data, it's not your metrics. You put somebody else's code is on your site. So that was a fun conversation. Another one would be, had a client where their metrics looked great. When you dug into the data, it turns out the tracking code was on their site twice. So they're getting double counted for everything. Another client where metrics looked great again, engagement numbers were incredible, but had to tell them, by the way, you haven't been tracking mobile for the past year. You've been blocking that mobile tracking. And your users are 60% mobile. So the good news is your traffic just doubled by fixing that. The bad news is you've been making business decisions off invalid data. So upfront tracking, testing, making sure it's working, probably just have a really good plan. Lots of different tools. Everybody's going to be different, so I'm not going to go into all these metrics, but these are some of the common metrics that we're looking for when we're evaluating. So again, it's just trying to plan ahead and pressure test what's going to be used. Wonderful tools. Most startups I know use Google Analytics, free tool, incredibly robust data that can give most everything that you need. Mobile app metrics are somewhat similar to website metrics. And they too have, Google Analytics launched a tool called Firebase Analytics, which is again free, or free in quotes, I should say, with Google, but can give you fantastic insights. So once that framework is in place, that planning framework is in place, your code's on there, not somebody else's code, your code's on there and it's working. Fast forward, this is how we're going to use that data. Once you put it in the beta or once you launch it, it's very simple. What's working, what's not working, ask why for each of those and how can we make it better. It's just a constant iteration on how to improve, how to make that tool better so we ultimately drive better outcomes in the end. When I first start out looking at the data, I'm not a pessimist, but I do start looking for the fires. Usually there are fires when you come in. Things that are your users communicating to you that it's not working. You know, your drop in usage, they're not engaging, the retention's terrible, high bounce rates. So those are the symptoms we try to diagnose and dig into the core cause of those problems. After you put out the fires, that data will be used for this is a Vanish Kaushik's approach that I agree with. It's kind of 3 big buckets. We'll look at the behavior, so what actions are the users taking on the site. We'll look at the voice of the customer, so we want to marry that quantitative, qualitative data so we really understand what's happening, you know, and why the user's doing what they're doing. And then ultimately the outcomes, making sure everything we're doing is trying to drive more positive outcomes. So the behavior analysis, that's just looking at what are they clicking at, what features on the site are they clicking at, and try to understand why. There could be a feature that is important to you, the user's not clicking on it, why are they not clicking on it? Is it they couldn't find it? Is it that it's not important to them? So you're always generating more questions, more things that you need to test. Again, lots of tools out there, which I think will be included in the conference notes, but different ways to understand what the users are clicking. You want to understand how they're navigating your site or your app. So you have your idea, your desired path that the user will take, A, B to C, but the user might be going A to D to B. And then those questions come up. Why is that? Is that a problem if they're doing that? Again, you're just trying to match what you want and what the user wants and eventually marry those two as close as possible. Google Analytics has great tools, again, that can measure that flow for you at very low cost or free. So you did the behavior analysis, the quantitative type data that tells you the what, but the why is what's missing. So we do like to go back and take a look at asking the user, why didn't you choose that? Why didn't you click that? Why did you go that way? And of course, there's many different ways, as you know, of pulling in that data. Again, working with startups, lots of free tools, or not free, but inexpensive tools that can help you capture that, including just asking them in person, in real life. And then lastly is the outcome analysis. So we try to understand the behavior, what they're doing on the site. We try to understand why they're doing it. We're always trying to iterate and improve and test. And the reason is we want to improve these conversions. So your identified macro conversions or your micro conversions. Macro would be like trying to get them to schedule an appointment or whatever metric is really aligned to your business goal. And the micro are the little things that'll help them get along the way, watching a video, looking at certain content. So again, always trying to be improving. One last point I want to make is I've been talking a lot about aggregate data, averages. The truth is beneath. Definitely want to look at segmentation. That's where the magic happens. So take your data, start segmenting, and that's where you'll uncover incredible insights that are going to really help along the way. And so the key takeaways: know what you're aiming for up front in the planning when you're evaluating. Make sure you're capturing the right data. And don't lose sight of what your ultimate outcome is. Always be monitoring. That happens a lot. You launch it and you're not watching it. You're not constantly digging. And just never stop learning. Never stop asking questions. Just being relentless. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions and comments. And so please come on up to the mic if you have a question. Well, I'd like to just maybe start off, each of you shared a little bit of a different perspective on evaluation, right? So maybe thinking through, like, if you were approached by a new startup, maybe it's around asthma management or something like that, what is the key points of advice you would tell them about evaluation, or from your different perspectives?
Start left and then go down. You know, I think we've seen a lot of actually different ways in which we've seen iterative approaches to development to really try and understand how to engage the user. I mean, I think that's the most critical. You know, what is it that you could do to influence behavior? Behavior change is the end all and be all, and then you can figure out all the other stuff behind it. So, you know, I to my mind, that's it. The segmentation piece also from the last talk is really critically important. If we're now responsible for the population that Duke takes care of, that means we're responsible for all kinds of segments of the population, those people who wear Fitbits and those who don't. So if our application just is approaching Fitbit, that's great, but that's not going to help George if he's in charge of population health. He's got to have a broader solution. So I think some ideas about where your sweet spot is your application can be standalone, or you can offer a portfolio of things to folks. That's going to be critically important.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'll come back to one of the words in my slide, which is simplicity, and specifically thinking about a complex clinical process, focusing on things that have been proven and developing a solution that's novel to deliver those things that are already proven is probably going to be a little easier than coming up with a novel scoring system and trying to generate enough evidence to suggest that's really going to be the ticket to usability and to driving clinical impact. So, you know, I think thinking about the user as either the person with asthma or the person receiving the data, and understanding which outcomes are most important to that user is really critical for designing the solution and tailoring it to that user.
I think from my perspective, what I would say is that I would not shy away from academia or, you know, sometimes academics, we have a lot of jargon or a lot of ways of talking, which, you know, jargon has a reason to be there, the same way the industry has its own jargon. But I think, at least in my experience over the last few years working with a few companies, I've seen a lot of benefits from them approaching us as content experts. And this is something that you already know, but I think I've seen real concrete examples of success following that approach. You know, the Mindful app, Mindful Daily that I collaborated with a few years ago, it was ranked number 3 as, you know, after a heuristic analysis of those 600 apps for mindfulness that are in the market. And I think part of that was the result of us working together in figuring out the components, how to lay out the structure, and what are the behavioral principles that are important and key, and even trying to solve misunderstandings about, you know, what behavior is, what mindfulness is, or what are, you know, how do you shape things up over time, and what are the clinical considerations to keep in mind. So I think in not being discouraged by that, even considering working in peer review and with academics and trying to be open, because I understand there's companies, they have to think about revenue, they have to think about the competition, they have to think about their sustainability. But I think there's a lot of benefit that can come out of that partnership, and so being open and receptive to work together, and try to mutually understand the different cultures. I think that's important.
The only other thing I would add, just from a user analytics part, and I talked about this a lot already, is just making sure you're very clear about what benefit your tool's providing, what are those metrics that you need to track, making sure there is a plan in place to bring those out. And I do also love taking a look at what else is out there, what types of publicly available information can you get for tools that are very similar, and what can you learn from what they've done and what metrics that they were tracking and how those are performing, and apply those to the design and build of your tool up front. But just again, trying to anticipate what's coming is my best recommendation in terms of applying usage analytics.
Great, great, yeah. Anybody questions we want to entertain? I think that, what you were mentioning about, making sure that your data is good quality, right, is very essential to the evaluation process, and thinking through that, and sort of, as you also mentioned, kind of evaluating on the fly in some respects, evaluate and iterate and evaluate, and having that good data behind the system. I think oftentimes we may want to think about a randomized clinical trial, but maybe that's not the right approach, as Dr. Schulman mentioned. So,
yeah. Actually, I enjoy sitting next to George and hearing his perspective, and I think it's actually critical for people to listen to. We talk a lot about the idea of a production engine and then the innovation group. And George is describing the challenges of working in the production environment. He's got a very complex set of processes. He's got not a lot of tolerance for error. There's not a lot of tolerance for experimentation. He's got 30 projects he's working on. And if you can't guarantee him that you're going to help him move his agenda forward, there's not a lot of room for you. And so that's a really important set of principles, but that's not any of the stuff we're talking about. Because by definition, we can't guarantee that kind of stuff. We're not going to seamlessly integrate with Epic and this and that and the other thing. You'll spend your whole life trying to develop interfaces to whatever the next system is, and never have some use. So I think at the end, this kind of goes back to where I started from. Are you greenfield or are you sustaining innovation? And I think you got to be really clear on that. So I think George has been pretty honest and straightforward what the world looks like to someone who's working in the belly of the beast in the production engine, and it's really, really hard for a startup to meet those criteria. So you really got to think about would you look for spaces where you can gain traction, either to get enough evidence that you can come back to George and say, our thing really works, or just have a different path to market. But if the only path to market is you do the hackathon, then you call on George, you're not going to get very far.
Hi, thanks so much for some really interesting and engaging presentations. I'm Sarah Wilson. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the VA and at the Duke Psychiatry Department. I had a question about cultural specificity and tailoring to subpopulations. So Roger, obviously your project specifically deals with that. I was curious about, for larger health systems or health informational websites, how you would go about evaluating those kinds of resources to ensure that there aren't subpopulations that may be being left behind or not able to engage with healthcare resources or healthcare information. Thanks.
So I can speak to that, at least from the health system side. I think, it's something many large organizations are in various stages of evolution learning about. From our standpoint, we have a codified mechanism to evaluate ethnicity and certain ethnographic data, and I think it's a challenge sometimes, particularly as someone who's at the bedside, reminding myself and reminding colleagues that when we are designing tools that need to educate people about their illnesses, often we need to start at a really basic level. And so, I think it can be off-putting for a highly educated person to interact with materials that are at a fifth grade reading level. Similarly, it is incomprehensible for someone who's at that fifth grade reading level to interact with materials that are much more advanced. So I'm not sure that there's a clear solution yet to really tailor those types of education materials to specific populations. It's a problem that we're aware of and that we're trying to figure out how to address.
I think it's a big challenge. In user-centered design, one of the part of the process is identifying your main persona, and this can be a tricky process because um, you can if you have a range of personas, um, you might nail down into X features, someone who's male and certain age or certain educational background, but not being an effective way to go that. And I think there's a little bit of I think it's a tricky process, and there's no perfect solution to working with, tailoring your intervention to specific groups. I like, however, the concept of universal design, and I think you're kind of tapping into that. Things, for example, like you know, designing things that address the needs of people with low and high literacy in a way that doesn't turn off people with high literacy, and it doesn't turn off people with low literacy. Things that could be effective for a broad range of people. Um, but so I think this kind of a concept of universal design can be a good way to work with. You know, if you can demonstrate you can design things for groups that have a lot of challenging cognitive or physical experiences, then that intervention can be effective for a much larger group of the population, and that's been the case with a lot of technologies we have nowadays available. But again, I think I'm not sure if I have there's a perfect solution, but I think thinking about those broad aspects can be helpful in orienting the design process.
Do you want to say? Yep.
Yeah, I will just comment on this as a former health disparities researcher. So first off, most of the things that you're interested in aren't in the database. So we don't record literacy when people come in. We don't record what's in their bank account when you ask them whether or not they're compliant with their medications. So I think as you think about the framework of what are the vulnerable characteristics of populations, we have a couple we measure, but there's a ton we don't. Some of those data are now available for you all over the place. If you could link Epic to their Facebook feed, I could figure out a lot more about people than I'll ever get from Epic. So I think part of it is framing the problem, and then this idea of segmentation. I mean, it's kind of nuts. You talk about Epic, but you guys all get your news from about 400 different websites, and there's only 100 people in the room, right? And so why is it that we're still in this mindset? We have one platform that we're serving things up on, or one piece of even giving out a piece of paper when you discharge. I mean, my kids are Snapchatting and videoing. They don't know how to read anymore, and so customizing a written communication things, might be nice. It's the dead tree version of things, but I think I think these are critical things. But the tools are all here. It's just our mindset is still, I'm supposed to tell the patient this thing, instead of thinking about something about the patient and then working backwards.
Great. Let's see. I think we have time for maybe one more question or comment. from the panel? Yeah.
I just have one more quick
Yeah, sure.
comment on that. When you said segmentation, I was just trying to brainstorm how I would go about this, and a couple things I would love to see is if you can find any partners out there that are already attempting to serve these populations or these communities. I would love it if more people would share their analytics data, their back end data, just so you can learn from it. We can all share all this hidden data. I think that would be tremendous across the board. If you're not able to find a partner or partners that are willing to do that, I would probably consider launching some type of test or content targeting that population, whether it be content or something like that, just so I can get some data in, and then segment and take a look at who these users are, what technology are they using, what are they not using, and try to get some type of data to grow from there.
Great, thank you. So we heard a lot of useful information. How do we evaluate? How do we know our stakeholders? Do we know who's the end user? Do we know who's the going to be advising others on the use of the product? Do we know how safe it is? Will it fit into the system? Does it work as it's advertised? And do we have the data to really evaluate that and look at that? Are we capturing that well? So this is a great panel discussion. Great. Thank you very much for coming in.